I first heard about Spain Rodriguez in a 1988 documentary called Comic Book Confidential. And it's sort of a very formative film for me to see. I was 11 when my dad took me to see it at an art house theater, and I was a budding artist at the time, and it kind of blew my mind, especially the portion on underground comics. That's where I first saw Spain and R. Crumb. And this film, Bad Attitude, the art of Spain Rodriguez, really strikes me as a fleshing out, a deeper exploration of the underground comics portion of that movie. You even talked to like Art Spiegelman and a number of other people who are profiled there, kind of catching up with where they're at now, what their current perspectives on comics and on Spain's influence in particular. So I want to know, what was it about Spain after his passing that you decided you needed to make a documentary kind of bringing this aspect of his life and his work to the world? What inspired you?
Well, good question, Ian, and I appreciate that. And I gotta say, it's always great talking to a comics fan. Those are the people that I relate to the most. Yeah, there were many motivations for making the movie, but one of them was, as you say, that there was a lot of criticism going on, actually, of underground comics. A lot of our sensibilities today are offended by the sexuality and a lot of the cultural anxiety that's expressed in underground comics. But I just felt like people don't get it. People didn't get that underground comics was such a reaction to the suppression of comics in the 1950s. People didn't even know that happened. And how we got, weird, bland things like Archie comics. That there had been these EC comics, these really dynamic comics that took on social issues and sexuality. And I felt like people needed to know that. And people also needed to know Spain's work, because he was my favorite of the underground cartoonists, though not the most famous of them. And I felt like his story both brought underground comics to the fore and a part of underground comics that people didn't know.
To that, what you just said there about the notoriety, where Spain kind of falls in that stack, it struck me that a number of his pop contemporaries, from Robert Crumb to even Hunter Thompson, who, watching this documentary, I found a bunch of weird parallels, the whole motorcycle club thing and, not being able to fit in with society kind of growing up. But it struck me as, these are kind of pop culture or countercultural icons who became countercultural celebrities in a lot of ways. I don't know if you can call that selling out, but I don't remember seeing like Trash Man calendars and movies being made about their exploits up until now. So I'm curious, in your interactions, with Spain, because you were married to him for a number of years, did he ever talk about selling out? Was there any kind of concept that, what he was doing, living his life to be all about the work and then later all about family? Did he ever regret not kind of licensing things out to, rake in all that cash?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure Spain ever could have sold out, because his comics were so radical. His comics were such a critique of, well, what he would have called the class struggle, what we now very politely call income inequality, that has just gotten worse. It gets worse every year. And it's been sort of horrifying to see people say, oh, the pandemic showed us how unequal things are. Well, if you didn't know how unequal things were, you weren't paying attention. And Spain was always, his comics were always about that, about income inequality. That was his major theme. So I don't think it was possible for him to sell out. People just didn't want to hear, and maybe still don't want to hear what he has to say. They would still rather focus on, sex and drugs and rock and roll, and not some of the cultural critique. And he would also refuse to do it. Occasionally he would be really low on money, and so he would go downtown to San Francisco and try to get a job in advertising or something like that. But he'd have all this sexual stuff in his portfolio. He'd take it downtown. He'd be like flipping through this stuff and saying, well, I'm gonna get that job. And it was like, oh, he was just unable really to sell out.
Yeah, and that's something that was eyebrow raising to me. I don't know if I wrote the exact quote down, but he was talking about culture and heritage and these ideas surrounding that, talking about how Columbus was sort of the reason he was able to become a success. I know that's a very controversial idea, but it does show quite a different and I think nuanced perspective that we don't see nowadays, especially in wider polite conversation.
Right. I made an effort to put all the warts into the film about Spain, all of his controversialness. And he does make a comment. He was a Spaniard. He was of Spanish descent. His father was an immigrant from Spain as an adult. And his name was Manuel Rodriguez. He changed his name to Spain, so he was very identified with that. And as the film shows, became very much a part of the Latino art community and our Latino art movement in San Francisco, and is credited with painting the first mural in the Mission District, the Latino area of San Francisco. But he would not stop being who he was. He didn't try to pass as being Latino, he wasn't. And he wanted to discuss the issues. And so he obviously, he wasn't gonna, pull down any statues of Columbus. And I like having that in the film because I like this to be something that we could talk about. He is probably wrong about that. I'm more inclined to say, we really need to talk about the atrocities that were committed by Columbus. But I like that I can have him in the film just being who he is. Yeah.
Sure. And I think the sense that I got, particularly around that quote, I'm not trying to say I endorse it. It was just very interesting to hear that perspective because you don't really get that. But I felt like if you were to sit down and ask him to dig into that, he could have a very intelligent and reasoned conversation. It wasn't just something to be put out there for shock value.
No, it wasn't. And in the bit of comics that I showed along with that, where he is depicting the Spaniards' conquest of the Incas, he does, where he puts his own face on the face of the conquistadors. What he has written there is, here we see the ignorant and uneducated Spaniards destroying a great culture. So he was speaking to it, but he was also, and I think this is something important for, and I just speak as a white person, we have to look at the things that we've done, but we have to, how can I say, it doesn't do us any good to beat ourselves up personally right now here in the 21st century. And he also needed to acknowledge if it wasn't for Columbus, he wouldn't be living in San Francisco. And there he was living in San Francisco. So,
right. And to that point, at one point, when you're talking in the film, you're questioning your motivations for making this work. Did I make this documentary to defend Spain or to defend myself? As someone who I believe identifies as a feminist, being married to someone who, put out work that was very confrontational and very seemingly anti-feminist on a lot of levels. In the other documentaries that have come out about underground comics, those were all sort of pre-Me Too, pre-2015, 2017 era. And you do get some great interviews in here with contemporary feminist, pop culture authors and publishers who can place Spain into a certain perspective. But I want to know, have you gotten any pushback in the film is screening now at Slamdance? Have you received any negative feedback for even just bringing this perspective to a wider audience?
Well, I did get one review that I don't really understand that said, on the one hand, I brought up the issue of sexism in Spain's work too much, and people don't really want to hear about it. But then I didn't resolve the issue. I didn't confront it head on. But I don't think we can resolve the issue. Sexism, it's a big issue. And I think what I was trying to show with Spain and what was true about Spain is that he depicted women in a sexual manner. And he was heterosexual and had a lot of lust, and he drew his lust and he depicted women sexually. but he was also very much a supporter of women's power. And that was true politically and everything he stood for and voted for and organized for. And it was true in his life, the way he supported. There's a cartoon in there where he comes to, he's cleaning up the house. It shows him doing the housework and saying that Susan is a more important member of society than he is. And was certainly true the way he was as a teacher and as a mentor. He was a teacher and mentor to young women, his daughter and other young girl artists. And I am not aware of ever there being any whiff of him being a sleazeball or a sexual harasser or anything like that.
And that's, a couple of things there. One, talking about Crumb's work as well, because he caught a lot of flack for his depictions of women. There's a lot of objectification, but there seems to be an undercurrent, I think, in both artists' work of women's power over men through their sexuality. It's not a conquering kind of attitude on the part of the men necessarily. It's almost like a subtle appreciation, possibly in the wrong kind of visual language.
Well, it is interesting. And to do this film, I had to do a lot of study of all of the Zapp artists. I mean, I actually sat down finally and read every copy of Zapp. I not only read it, but I did, I love color-coded diagrams. I did color-coded diagrams of every incident of sex and violence in Zapp comics towards women and towards men. I counted them and tried to analyze them. I know it's an obsessive mind.
No, I want to see this. I want to see this chart. It's got to be the size of an entire room.
I know. Be careful what you ask for, Ian. That's all I can say. The color-coded diagram of sex and violence in Zapp. But I really saw how each artist was different, of course. Spain was really a ladies' man. Women loved him. He had all the relationships he wanted. He had a powerful mother who was an artist, and a sister who's in the film who was an intellectual, a PhD. So he never grew up with, sort of fear or dislike of women. So I don't think that's ever in his comics. His comics show lust for women. And often women are very powerful in his comics. Crumb, on the other hand, has a very different personal story. Crumb has very much of a story of not being able to get laid, being the thin, geeky guy who just couldn't get laid, and then becomes famous, and then everyone is running to him. So Crumb has a certain cynicism about women and a little bit of bitterness that one would have if you've lived that life experience.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I hadn't sort of contextualized the idea of the power that women have in each of their works. It is a very, very different mindset. So one thing I want to talk about is the actual artwork that's presented in the film. It's littered with these marvelous blow-ups of his gorgeous, ink work. And you can even see the pencil marks and the sort of like the lighter ink strokes underneath the big blacks, which is wonderful stuff. Did all this come from your personal collection? Did you have all this stuff in giant files, or did you have to go to collectors and publishers to get the originals? How did you pull all this together?
Well, that's good. I like to say about Spain, he never met a piece of paper he didn't like. And he never threw anything away. So he kept every piece of paper. A lot of it was just thrown into a closet where it got mildewed. So the family does have a huge collection, but it had to be organized. It had to be cleaned. Some of it was damaged, had to be demildewed, and had to be organized. And I had a team of people. And part of the 8-year journey of making the film was that we boxed everything with special archival paper and made created a whole new visual database to organize the art. And also ultimately we had to rescan everything we used in the film at 4K. That's why you can see it so well with the pencil lines. And then we had the wonderful experience of, I searched the internet and found this New York artist, Noel Honig, a motion graphics artist who created the visual look of the film, because it was one of the things that was really hard was that comics are a vertical medium and film is a horizontal.
Yes.
And it was like, how are we gonna, this was just not working. And Noel made it work by figuring out how to tell the story, how to use the camera on the art to tell the story.
Yeah, and very successfully too. It's a very immersive documentary, certainly visually. The ending animation. Well, first I want to thank you for the way that you present the end of Spain's life. It's a shocking kind of a jump moment in time. You don't get into full details about exactly what has happened. There's not a big, heavy diagnosis scene or anything like that. But the way that he exits the film is through this lovely artistic tribute of Nora. It is your daughter and Spain's daughter, correct?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that I got a little confused because I think in the film she was referred to as your daughter and Spain's daughter, and it was like yeah. I don't know exactly. There's something about the title of the card in there that threw me off. But okay, I'll stop rambling. But Nora is a great artist in her own right. Did she create that bit of animation that we see when she's describing her last moments with her father?
That is part of a longer animation she did that had to do with Spain's death. And I edited it down somewhat and then used it with her telling the story of being with him at his deathbed. It's one of the most moving things I've seen in a film in years. It's a combination of the concept of the animation, the execution of the animation, and the score by the composer B. Quincy Griffin. Can you talk about how that was conceived? Was that the way that you pictured doing this tribute from the conception of the film? Did it come out while you were putting it together and editing it? And I assume you had to plan how this animation was going to happen at some point. Well, I really have to give a lot of credit to the first editor who worked on the film, Elizabeth Finlayson, who found B. Quincy Griffin and found that piece of music and put that music together with the animation that Nora did. We were able to get her to tell the deathbed story way later in the filming and then put that together. But I've got to say, I've never made scripted documentaries. For me, it's a process of, this film was like a million shards of glass that were rearranged and glued together. And it was only we had 4 different editors working that it took shape.
Wow. Yeah. I guess, yeah, the idea of it being scripted, I didn't mean to imply that you had written the entire thing out. I was just curious if that was, because I imagine telling that part of the story has to be very difficult. So I imagine you're running through different ways of presenting it and kind of closing out the film. So I was curious as to how that all came together. But I guess it is a collaboration, as you're saying, of taking all this wonderful footage and artwork and music and just making the most moving piece out of it. And bravo.
Yeah.
I am not ashamed to admit that I cried watching that.
Good. I'm glad. I do too.
But to close it out, the Bad Attitude is premiering at Slamdance right now. People can go to the Slamdance website, from what I understand, and buy a virtual ticket to watch it through February 25th. What is the wider release plan? Is there going to be, well, I don't know when theaters are really coming back, but is there a streaming, a Blu-ray kind of rollout planned?
Well, I'm talking to a couple of different distributors now. So I'm hoping, I would like to have it, I don't know, for some reason I feel like the places that I see this film being seen are drive-in theaters, which are perfect for COVID. So I'd love it to get in some more festivals. I'd love to see it have a drive-in theater run where you could, take your wine or your beer or smoke some dope. And that's legal here in California where I am.
It's legal here in Chicago too, so yeah.
Oh, it is?
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, we're legal, where you can relax and see this film. I'm hoping, I'd love to have it in drive-ins. I think it will be on television. It will be, I hope, on one of the streaming services. That's yet to be worked out, but we'll let people know about it. Because what I feel like, this is a fun film. You know, this is not a eat your broccoli documentary. And this is a fun, this is a fun film for all ages. I was talking to a friend last night. They said they watched it, and they watched it with their 17-year-old. And usually he like leaves, you know, when mom and dad are watching something, he's out of there. But he was there the whole time because he's into comics, and he's into television shows that are based on comics and movies that are based on comics. And he had no idea how our society became so, our entertainment became so based on comics, where that came from. And Bad Attitude tells you that story too, how we got where we are.
Yeah, and that really is an excellent point, because we don't even really think of the medium that this sprang from anymore. It's all just content on Netflix or, you know, big blockbuster movies, but it did all come from people crowding around and drawing these funny little comics and cartoons and getting them out there any way they could. So yeah, congratulations again on Bad Attitude. It's a fantastic film, and yeah, congratulations to you and the entire team who put it together. It's really a special tribute to a great husband, artist, father, just a man. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Pleasure being here.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.